to report on how we are traveling with the with fishing. How are the fish surviving? What are the stocks doing? What is sustainable fishing? And they found that since the 1950s, the fishing capacity has gone up 63%. It's gone up more now. This is 2016 we're talking. So the fishing capacity has gone up 63%, but the amount of fish to fish has gone down by 87%. So these guys, the Global Ocean Commission, released this report, and it was frowned upon, so the Global Ocean Commission was shut down. But these figures, thankfully, are still out there. So the fishing fleet since the 1950s has gone up actually 10 times, but the catch has gone down 5 times. So, and we're still subsidising this, which is very crazy. Climate, I don't want to dwell on this, but there are many tipping points that we are now hitting. And food systems within climate will cause dangerous global warming, even if we tomorrow shut down all fossil fuels. If we stop burning all fossil fuels tomorrow, food systems alone will drive us into dangerous global warming. And what is the highest impact solution to climate change? Well, we've got some proposed geoengineering and proposed systems that can pull carbon dioxide out of air, but they're ridiculously inefficient. The most efficient of all is the tree. Isn't that marvelous? And you'll find that reforestation or afforestation is the leading solution to climate change in all of those serious studies that look at what can we do about climate. The most effective thing we can do is grow trees. And if we rewild pastures, just pastures alone, we draw down enough decades of emissions. And of course, if we had less ruminants on those pastures, if we had less red meat and dairy along with that, the methane would also contribute a lot. The reduction in methane would contribute a lot to slowing down global warming. But what do we need to do to rewild those areas? Well, we now use 2 things to suppress nature bouncing back, to suppress the growth of forests, and they're equally effective. The first one is fire, and we burn the world, as you saw, and they're deforestation fires, but they're also pasture maintenance fires. And we've been doing that for a long time. Even Indigenous people have been doing that. And it's done to kill the dead grass, which is in the wet season it grows long, in the dry season it's dead and unpalatable. So we burn that off to create green pick for the next season. But we also kill the ticks as we're doing that, which is good for raising cattle. So we burn the dead grass and we burn with it any seedlings that have popped their heads up. So we stop the forest from coming back by burning. So that's a very effective method. The other incredibly effective method of stopping forests from coming back is ruminants, sheep and goats in particular, and cattle as well. But if you've ever seen any photos of the Scottish Highlands, you'll see that there's no trees. And what happens is that if a tree seedling pops its head up, bang, it's gone. The sheep just love that stuff. So the trees haven't got a hope. There are some reforestation programs, but the very word, the name of Scotland used to be Caledonia, which means forest. So that whole moonscape that is there now used to be forest. So sheep particularly have been the terra formos in that case. So, and we know that the lowest cost and the largest scale and the most natural fix for climate change is rewilding. And it's been equated to a diet. If we go to a low meat diet, this is the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. If we go to a low meat diet, it's half the cost of any other mitigation measure. If we go to the vegan diet, it's 20% of the cost of any other mitigation measure. And this is why the vegan diet reduces land use by an area the size of Africa. And nature is ready and willing to bounce back. This here is Victoria, where there's been clear felling deforestation. So everything's been taken out and it's actually burned with drip torch from a helicopter and left alone. And this is how it comes back. So if we can seriously think about how we use our planet, and the greatest land use on the planet by far is grazing land. That takes up 37% of the planet. And next comes crops, which is 12% of the planet, of which half go to feeding animals. So over 40% of the land area, the ice-free land area of planet Earth, is devoted to growing animals. So if we rewild some of that land, just the grazing land, it'll solve the biodiversity crisis, solve the climate crisis, solve the deforestation crisis, fix the water cycles, and go a long way towards nutrient pollution reversing. But the problem is this requires diet change. So what is the diet change? Okay, well, there's been a number of reports. This is just one, but it's what the WWF did a few years back, and they looked at meat consumption, and they said that globally, meat consumption must fall by 3/4 to be sustainable, so that we have a sustainable food system to support future generations. It must fall by 3/4. And of course, that's globally. So in Western countries like Australia, like in North America, where we have the Western diet, the meat consumption in those countries must reduce by over 90%. So that's the sustainable level. It's more than 90%. And we've actually attributed to each of these. So for climate, for biodiversity loss, water security, deforestation, nitrogen, zoonotic disease, oceans health, and human health, we've discovered, or we've estimated what needs to reduce for each of those. For example, for water security, we must replace 75% of meat with plant proteins, just to have sustainable water for the planet. And as Jonathan Foley, who's the head of the Project Drawdown, as Jonathan Foley says, things happen very, very, very slowly and then all at once. So that's my hope as well. So what I want to touch on before I get to the breaking news is some of the myths that surround animal agriculture these days. Regenerative ranching is probably the biggest of all, scam of all. It's remarkably good advertising. It's incredible marketing. But unfortunately, it does not do what it says on the packet. Regenerative ranching is not going to save the climate. That Alan Savory talk from 2013 was hugely influential, and it's got such a following now that even governments are supporting these ideas. But the problem is it just doesn't work. Other documentaries like Soil Carbon Cowboys and even Kiss the Ground have supported it. So they've got the public behind them. But the bottom line is if we restore all of the world's grazing soils, okay, they're saying that soil carbon, replenishing the soil carbon will solve the climate. Okay, if we do that, if we restore all the degraded soils, in this bar chart, the blue area is the amount of carbon that will store. Surprisingly little. If we restore the carbon of all the world's crops, okay, so this is grazing soils, if this is the world's croplands, if we restore those soils, we can draw down a lot more carbon. And this is interesting because we turn over the soil in croplands, and because of that, we break up the structure, we break up the living things in the soil. We also expose it to the air, and a lot of the carbon is lost. So there's a lot more carbon lost out of crop soils than there is out of grazing soils. But if we restore the forests that used to be the former forests on grazing lands, this here is that amount. So the restoration potential in the above ground carbon is way, way more. The soil carbon is only a few percent of what the above ground carbon would be if we restored the forest that used to be on grazing lands. And for interest, I've also got here a bar of showing what would happen if we restored forest on all of the built up areas in the world, all of the cities, all of the transport, all of the mines, all of the roads and bridges. If we restored the carbon, restored the forests on those lands, this would be the potential here. So that's the above ground carbon. So cities and mines and all of the built up areas, they take just 1% of the land, whereas grazing lands take 37% of the land. So we are squandering, perhaps is what our most valuable asset is. What do we value in life? Family comes first. Land, I would say, is second. And we squander 37% of our land for growing grass-fed animals, from which we get 14% of our protein. In fact, if you look at the animals that are exclusively grass-fed, which is what some people advocate we should do, we should only eat grass-fed animals. The animals that are exclusively grass-fed now, they account for just 1% of our protein intake. So for very little food, we are squandering 37%, the biggest chunk of our land by far. And I did a little bit of work on regenerative grazing a little while back, and there is some evidence produced that supports the thesis that regenerative grazing can restore soil carbon. And if you look at this evidence closely, you'll find 3 factors that are commonly used to make it look good. And I've called these the Regenerative Grazing Bluffer's Guide to Soil Carbon. And the first thing they do is import nutrients. Like, for example, White Oaks Farm, where this picture is, they import grain, they feed it to chickens. The chickens poop on the ground, and that stimulates growth of the grass, and the cattle eat the grass. Now, because you have grass growth, you also have roots growth, and you have stimulated soil carbon in the soil. So they can show on White Oaks Farm that the soil carbon is increasing, definitely. But where's that soil carbon coming from? It's coming from the grain that they fed to the chickens that pooped on the soil, and so you're importing carbon. Now, how sustainable is that? This system relies on grain grown elsewhere. So that's the first thing they use. The second thing they use is a stocking rate. And there was a study done in Australia on how profitable regenerative grazing was compared to conventional grazing. And they did this over hundreds of different properties. And they found that regenerative grazing produced only half the profit of conventional grazing. And the reason was because they had half the cattle. Now, it's easy to make the grass grow to increase the soil. Okay, grass grows and it has roots, and that feeds the soil, so you get carbon in the soil. The carbon comes from photosynthesis in the leaves, nowhere else. It comes from the leaves and it ends up in the soil. But you've got to have things growing to introduce that to the soil. So the carbon is increasing if you have greater grass growth. So if you take off half the cattle, you will have greater grass growth. So this is number two. This is how to increase the soil carbon. Number three is commonly done, and many of the studies that support regenerative grazing use this trick. And that is, if you take cropland, which is, as we saw before, it's depleted of carbon. A lot of the carbon has been lost. If you take that to be grassland, growing anything that perennially, rather than ripping it out each year, if you grow grass that stays there, you will increase the soil carbon, no question. So these are the three things that you should look for if you're evaluating a study that supposedly supports regenerative grazing claims. Look for these three things. That's the bluffer's guide. Okay, another myth is that there used to be more bison on the plains than there are now. Well, we have 7 times the biomass of farmed animals, more biomass in the farmed animals than we had 10,000 years ago. Okay, so most of them are cattle. So the grazing pressure is from a few million bison is nothing like the grazing pressure from hundreds of million. In fact, there's over 1.5 billion cattle on Earth now. And you can see this. This is outlined in red. This is how much biomass, that is the weight of wild animals in 10,000 years ago. And this is the biomass or weight of farmed animals now. And another argument is that it's a natural cycle. Well, as you saw from the numbers of cattle that we have on planet Earth now is way beyond anything that's natural. And this gives you an idea of how much methane each of these animals, including humans, produces. So cattle are by far the biggest. They have these multiple stomachs, and they need bacterial activity on the cellulose and other fibers that they eat to break that down so that they can use that. And part of that produces methane, which is then enters the bloodstream, which is then burped out. Another myth is that livestock, farmed animals are needed in developing countries as wealth and as food security. And this is proving exactly the wrong way to go in Africa. For over a decade now, they've had such extreme droughts that, 2 decades, I should say, they've had such extreme droughts that they've lost all of their wealth. And the Kenyan government has assisted. The last report I read had 5,000 traditional herders were taken by the Kenyan government, and they were given land, and they were taught how to grow crops sustainably with limited water, and even cash crops like aloe vera. They're cash crops, and they've also got subsistence crops. So food security and wealth, both those arguments are out the window now. And manure for fertility, this is perhaps one of the most muddle-headed ideas out there. As I said, fertility, the nitrogen that we use for producing crops is the worst polluter of water globally. And we're talking about taking that nitrogen and taking that waste from animals and putting it on farms. It's toxic for a start. It's full of chemicals and hormones, but it's also got the pathogens. It's full of pathogens. In fact, what happens now? I did a study recently, as a piggery, not in a few hundred k's away,